Welcome to week 8, our second online class, or you all read about functional behavior assessments. So, in today's brief recording, I'm going to go over some of the content in chapter 24 about FBAs, and then at the end, I'll go over some reminders for your behavior change project, major topics, SAFMEDS, and quiz 2. So, the first question asked, what is the purpose of an FBA? So, hopefully, your answer was somewhat along the lines of to determine the function of a behavior in order to develop a behavior intervention plan that replaces the inappropriate behavior with an appropriate behavior. So, we conduct FBAs when there is an inappropriate behavior that's interfering with an individual's life in some way. So, it's preventing learning, preventing an area of daily living, causing injury or harm to others, right? And so when we have those behaviors, which are really common in individuals with disabilities, the FBA is the scientific process we go through to identify why is that inappropriate behavior happening. So that's the function. And once we know the function of why it's happening, then we can determine how can we have an appropriate behavior that we replace it with, right? And so this goes back to our positivist views in behavior analysis, where the goal is to improve the lives of individuals through the science of ABA. Question 2 asks you to give an original example of problem behavior maintained by three types of positive reinforcement. So remember, when we think about the functions of behavior, one of them can be to get things. So wanting positive reinforcement, the addition of stimuli in their environment. And so they can either be trying to get attention, tangible items, or it can be automatic reinforcement. Remember, automatic being things that feel good, look good, sound good, taste good, all those things. Okay. So one example of trying to of a behavior for seeking positive reinforcement in the form of attention could be talking out in class. Now, talking out in class might not always be attention seeking or trying to get positive reinforcement that way, but it might be. An example of tangible of a problem behavior maintained by positive reinforcement in the form of tangible reinforcement would be tantruming in the grocery store for candy at the checkout, right? So tantrum being the problem behavior, and why it's so that we can get because I know that if I throw a fit, basically that my mom will give me candy when I check out. And for mom's behavior, that would be a problem behavior maintained by negative reinforcement, right? The removal of that aversive stimulus of their child tantruming in public. Though tantruming in private's not much better either. And the third type, the example I gave is automatic reinforcement. So, right, that's look good, feel good, taste good, sounds good, all those things. So, rocking back and forth, okay? I do it because when I do that, it feels good. Now, rocking back and forth isn't always a problem behavior, right? There are times when that's just sort of a self-regulation behavior and it's not a big deal. But there might be times that that is inappropriate, or if it's to a degree or a magnitude that's inappropriate, like if you're rocking your whole chair back and forth, or bumping into others, or things like that. Question 3 asks for an original example of a problem behavior maintained by negative reinforcement, one being escape, so escape, social escape, and the other automatic. So if you have a student who every time they are presented with group work, they ask to go to the bathroom, well, the function of going to the bathroom might be because they don't want to do group work either. Um, the social requirements are anxiety inducing, or there's someone in the group that they don't want to work with, or for whatever reason. So the problem behavior is leaving class. Why they do it, the function is negative reinforcement, removing the negative stimulus of, or the aversive stimulus of group work. An example of automatic negative reinforcement is, let's say, during music class. The student does not like the sound of the recorders. I don't know who does. Plugging, covering up their ears is negative reinforcement because it's making something feel better by plugging up their ears. Question 4. Why does the topography or form of behavior often reveal little useful information? Okay, and why is it not really helpful to just describe what it looks like? Well, because multiple behaviors can have the same topographies but different functions. So simply, focusing on tantruming behavior or focusing on screaming behavior isn't really helpful if we don't know why it's happening. What's the function of the screaming, right? And here's an example. So let's say you have two scenarios. One, and we're all talking about screaming. So the form of the behavior, what it looks like is the same, screaming. In one case, it might be maintained by positive reinforcement. Okay, so the antecedent is kids playing instruments in music class, and John is given a tambourine. John screams. The paraprofessional might give John a different instrument. So in this case, the screaming might be access to a different tangible item. He was seeking positive reinforcement through access to, let's say, the maraca. Okay. Second example, still the same setting. We're in music class, the behavior is screaming, but in this case it's going to be maintained by negative reinforcement. So the kids are playing instruments in class, John is given the tambourine, John screams, maybe the paraprofessional removes John from music class. Okay, so in this case he's screaming for escape, social escape, or it could be automatic escape from the sound of children playing the instruments, right? So simply saying John screams in music class, well, that's not helpful. Okay, we need to know what are the contingencies around John's screaming behavior, and that is the ultimate goal of the FBA, to understand those antecedent and consequence contingencies and the effects they have. So I gave you the scenario of Oliver hates to read aloud in front of his peers and gets a lot of anxiety just thinking about it. Oliver often argues with the teacher when she asks him to go to reading group. As a result, Oliver's teacher often sends him to timeout and he misses the entire reading lesson. She had two kind of assignments here. One is to draw and label a four-term contingency to diagram the arguing and the behavior. So that's the B, the behavior. And then instead of relying on the teacher's default technology, so timeout, what other intervention would address the function of Oliver's arguing? Okay, so the AO, because remember it's a four-term contingency. So in a four-term contingency, we need to identify the motivating operation. In this case, it's an AO, or an abolishing operation, right? So it's decreasing the value of of the reinforcer. So Oliver dislikes reading in front of peers. And then when his teacher asks him to go to the reading group, that means that he is very unwilling to go. He argues with the teacher and she sends him to timeout. Well, his behavior was just reinforced, right? He didn't want to go to reading time in the reading group in the first place because it might, because the negative behavior was, what he didn't want was present there. So, if I go to reading group, I might have to read out loud. But if I don't go to reading group, I'm definitely not going to have to read out loud. So an alternative intervention, instead of that timeout, which is actually negative reinforcement, the teacher could tell O ahead of time, you don't have to read in front of peers. Like if she said, it's time to go to reading group, don't worry, you're not going to have to read out loud. Well, then it's less likely that he's going to argue with the teacher. 6. Which method of FBA allows practitioners to confirm a hypothesis? Okay, and that is a functional analysis or a functional observation. That is when we can confirm a hypothesis. That's how we can actually scientifically know what the function of the behavior is. So we might, I'm skipping ahead a bit, but we might be able to identify some possible functions of behavior, but the only way to truly know is to sort of conduct an experiment, and that is what FA or FOs are. They're the systematic experimental manipulation of antecedents and consequences to determine the function of the behavior. Okay, so you're actually evoking the behavior and trying to see when does it happen, when does it not happen. So when the behavior increases, that's when you know, oh, ding, ding, ding. It's like when the teacher or the doctor taps on your knee and might be tapping around, and when he finds it, oh, you kick, he found the spot. So similarly, FAs and FOs, and those sort of interchangeable terms, they identify that kick point, that that's what that person is seeking, and now I can use that and capitalize on that to develop a behavior intervention plan. So there's a continuum of FBA methods as outlined in your book. So sort of the higher up the pyramid we go, the more precise it is, or the more likely that we are going to sort of get that kick point, but it's also more difficult, time intensive, and all of that. So just be aware that these indirect assessments are less difficult to do, but the trade-off of that is less precise. The analog FAs are more precise, but also more difficult and time intensive. So functional or experimental analysis is when the antecedents and consequences are arranged so that their effects can be observed and measured. Again, this is that experimental um, uh, technique. It's often referred to as analog. Um, so typically you assess different conditions. You have to decide a contingent attention condition, contingent escape, alone, and a control like free play. And you present these different conditions one at a time until a pattern of problem behavior emerges. And I have some additional resources for you that really go into. So if you listen to the Behavior Observations podcast with Dr. Wayne Fisher, he's a pretty well known fella in behavior analysis, especially in problem behaviors. And so this podcast might give you even more in-depth information and examples of how you could use FA to then develop a function-based treatment. While I'm here, I also have this IRIS module linked on FBAs that you could go through. I'm not asking you to turn any of that in, just for more information if you're interested. And Behavior Babe has a great functions of behavior video that you could check out. So in the FA, we present these different conditions which try and invoke the problem behavior, okay, and you graph it. And so then once you've graphed the rates of the problem behavior or frequency or, whatever duration, whatever makes sense for the problem behavior that you are addressing, we then see when did the problem behavior happen and when did it not happen. So if we look at this graph, we see the free play condition, the alone condition, the contingent escape, and contingent attention. And we see that, when there's a contingent attention consequence, the behavior occurs most often. And so then you would assume then the function is attention, right? Whereas in these conditions, it didn't really evoke it. If we look at this graph, we see a split. So we see that the problem behavior occurred much more often when the student was allowed to escape. Okay, so in this case, they're seeking negative reinforcement. And they're trying to escape an aversive stimulus. If we look at this graph, we see it's alone. So it means that in free play, nothing, low rates of behavior, attention, low rates of behavior, contingent escape, low rates of behavior. But when you just left them alone, there were high rates. And in that case, it might be an automatic reinforcement. They might just enjoy doing it. Looks good, sound good, feel good, taste good. Now, there also can be an undifferentiated pattern, or it's inconclusive. So we're reading this just like we would an alternating treatment design, and we see that there's really not a pattern, right? We have a little bit of this contingent escape is pretty high, but it's not necessarily undifferentiated from these other conditions. And so in this case, it's inconclusive, and it might be automatic reinforcement at play. So some advantages of the functional analysis is that you really can see a clear demonstration of what variables relate to the occurrence of problem behavior, right? Like it's very clear here that this problem behavior was more at a higher rate when the individual is alone. Therefore, we can sort of assume automatic reinforcement. So it's a pretty it's a high standard. So anytime we're looking at other FBAs, we're sort of comparing them to the standard of an FA. However, there are some limitations. Okay, during the FA, we're trying to evoke the behavior, right? And so we're trying to see what is reinforcing to it. We have just reinforced it. So what does that do? That increases the likelihood of the behavior happening again. So you might actually temporarily strengthen that behavior that you are trying to decrease. Also, the behavior may acquire new functions. Okay, you're presenting them with contingencies they weren't previously aware of, and they're sort of becoming aware that, I can still get what I want in this way too. It might be not very acceptable to teachers, to parents, to the individual, because again, you are evoking a problem behavior. And so there's some ethics that you need to really consider there. So it's not really appropriate for low frequency behaviors, things that don't happen very often but are pretty serious, like maybe extreme aggression. But if that aggression only happens like once a week, once every other week, just evoking that is not ethical. And similarly, if you've contrived this too much, you might not actually be identifying the variables that are related to the problem behavior. So this typically can't just it might be difficult to do an FA in the classroom setting during the natural routines, and yet when you sort of remove the student and try to evoke the behaviors, you may not be able to. You might get that undifferentiated pattern because what's actually causing the problem behavior is related to some sort of stimulus or antecedents in the classroom. And also, it requires time, effort, and professional expertise. So, FAs generally are not commonly done in school settings routinely. For this reason, it's really reserved for the most serious behavior, and only if you have someone who is qualified to conduct it and analyze results. So we don't always have to do an FA. So the FBA process is sort of more broad than that. And so the 4 steps are to gather indirect and descriptive information, interpret them to form the hypothesis about the purpose of behavior, test your hypothesis, if you can, using an FA, and then develop intervention-based function. So this descriptive FBA is another sort of method, and that's when we observe the problem behavior under naturally occurring conditions. We do not arrange them in a systematic manner. We are not causing or evoking. We are not intervening to cause the behavior to happen or to cause it not to happen, right? We're not putting any intervention in place. We're just observing the natural environment. And there's a couple different ways to do that. ABC is probably the most common, either continuous or narrative, and then also scatter plot's one that I'll review. So in continuous ABC recording, you record occurrences of the problem behaviors with as long as what environmental events are occurring, so antecedents and consequences, and you do it during a very specified period of time. Okay, some advantages are that it's very precise because we're recording exactly what happened. It can provide a lot of contextual information, which again, is going to be important to know sort of all the different variables at play for why the problem behavior is happening. And it does not require disruption of an individual's routine. Here's an example of a continuous recording form. That's in your book. And so you can see that you have antecedents that you can check off, behaviors that you can check off, and consequences. And so this form can either be used as is or can be sort of a template that you use. Perhaps there are multiple behaviors that you are addressing. So those can be listed, and you can sort of brainstorm the antecedents and consequences, of course, being able to write in others that you notice. And so this is great because it's a little bit quicker to be able to do. It's not requiring long form notes, but there are some limitations, and that's the antecedents and consequences may not immediately proceed and follow the problem behavior, so it might be sort of difficult to detect those. Another option is narrative recording, and so that's when you only collect data when you see the behavior of interest, so it's sort of open-ended. So you're not recording everything that's going on. You just wait until you see, one of the behaviors of interest, and then you record what happened before and what happened after. And so here's an example form. You see, you're really just when a problem behavior occurs, you fill it in, and then what happened immediately before and what happened after. Some difficulties here is you might have false positive because you're only looking at data when the problem behavior occurs. And so those same antecedent consequence events may be present when the problem behavior is absent, right? And so you may notice, every time this problem behavior occurs, the teacher asked him a question, but what you aren't getting from this sheet is all the times the teacher asked a question and the problem behavior did not occur, right? So you might get those false positives. Also, reliability might be low. So if you had 2 people observing, they might not see the exact same things. So it's relying on a lot of observer inference. Scatterplot is another procedure you can use for recording to the extent to which a behavior occurs more at particular times than others. So that might be helpful for you then to decide when do you need to do these more in-depth observations. So you divide your day into blocks of time, and each time period you can have some sort of symbol to indicate, whether the behavior occurred some or not at all, or if you have some sort of scale. And then you identify those patterns, and then that might help you then decide, okay, this is when we're going to do that continuous ABC recording that's more intensive, so we're not sort of wasting time with the behavior specialist coming in and observing the student in the mornings when it's actually the afternoons that the problem behavior is occurring. So here's a sample scatter plot. You can see that we have the time listed, and then you might have some sort of code that you use, and then you would fill it in as you see the behavior occur. So advantage again is that you can identify time periods when the problem behavior occurs. It can be useful for when more focused ABC assessments can be conducted. One limitation is they're somewhat subjective, but I think this would be a great tool to give a classroom teacher, for example, or a parent to use maybe over a week or 2 week time period, and then the behavior analyst can go in and look and see, look for the patterns and decide when to do the more intensive assessments. So in addition, we can do an indirect FBA, and that's they're considered indirect because they don't involve actually observing the behavior. Rather, you're talking to someone else about what they think about the behavior. We know that's subjective, but it can come in the form of structured interviews, checklists, rating scales, and questionnaires. There's several of these. So in a structured behavioral interview, you really want to know from an informant, so significant other, teacher, parent. Maybe you could ask the individual themselves, when do they see this happening? What are the things that sort of surround the behavior? Another example is behavior rating scales. And so that's where maybe you ask again an informant, so that's either a student, the individual themselves, or parent, caregiver, teacher, about when the behavior happens, and help develop some hypotheses based on that. Some advantages of this indirect FBA is you can use it as sort of a first level assessment to then guide the more intensive and precise assessments. And they're convenient, right? Because we can just sit around the table or talk over the phone and complete them. However, this really shouldn't be the primary way that you identify functions of behavior. It's good for developing a hypothesis that you then test. Informants are obviously biased. We know that memory is subjective and our memories are very inaccurate. So it's not really a reliable way to identify a function of behavior. But it is important that we do some interviews with the care provider so that we can get some more information on target behaviors, identify potential antecedents and consequences. And then the direct observations are important because we can confirm or disconfirm sort of the information obtained in the interviews. Once you get the information and you formulate a hypothesis, you want to do that in an ABC format. So we don't want to just say, I think she screams because she hates washing hands, right? We want to identify what are the possible antecedents, what is that target behavior, and what is the consequence. So when Tanisha is prompted to wash her hands, she screams in tantrums and then doesn't have to do hand washing anymore. Okay, so the function would be escape from hand washing or lunch, one of those two. So we don't know, is it the hand washing she doesn't want to do, or is it maybe she doesn't want to go to the cafeteria to eat lunch? So the data collection does not end with conducting the FBA, right? We then want to develop an intervention and analyze its effectiveness. So the FBA doesn't identify what interventions will be effective. It identifies powerful reinforcers that can be used in the intervention. So once we know the function of the behavior, we can develop a plan to teach alternative behaviors or competing behaviors that have the same function, right? Because if the student wants social attention, we need to develop an intervention that appropriately gains them social attention, for example. So it needs to have that functional equivalence. If it's a problem behavior, it's usually an escape function. The intervention should provide escape, but for alternative behavior. So, for example, rather than crumpling up their paper and throwing it on the floor, teaching them to request help or teaching them to ask for a break. Or you might alter task demands to make escape less reinforcing. Okay, so maybe we're going to use a high probability sequence in order to sort of not make them want to escape it, or increase the engagement somehow, or alter the antecedents and the task you're asking them to do, maybe pre-session pairing, incorporating preferences so that they no longer want to escape, right? So we are decreasing the EO, causing an AO. If the problem behavior is a function of gaining something, it's positive reinforcement, then intervention should provide the desired outcome. So if what they want is access to something, we need to teach them an alternative behavior that wants access, that provides access. Or we can alter the antecedent conditions to make attention or tangibles less reinforcing. So for example, you have a child who calls out a lot in class for social attention. Can we and so there's a strong evocative effect, an establishing operation. Can we maybe before class give them a whole bunch of social attention, and so then it's decreased the value of that social attention, like they're kind of full, they've got it. So you want to alter the ABC contingency. So if we look at this example of when Deshaun is left alone with toys or work, he hits others and then he gets attention. Okay, so he's alone seeking attention. So what if instead we can alter the antecedent? Deshaun is provided with a peer buddy during work and play periods. So now it doesn't matter. He's not going to hit others, because remember before he was hit others when he was left alone. So we alter the antecedent condition by not leaving him alone. Another example is we can alter the behavior. And so that's when we teach an alternative or competing behavior. So when Deshaun is left alone, we prompt him to ask a peer adult to play or help. And so then he's getting attention appropriately by requesting it rather than inappropriately through the reprimand. Because to him, he doesn't care if it's a reprimand or not, it's still social attention. Or we can alter the consequence. So if he hits others, we could sort of neutrally block the hitting and continue to ignore Deshaun. So not giving him the attention. So, as I mentioned, I have some additional resources for you: the IRIS module, behavior observations podcast, and Behavior Babe functions of behavior videos, so you can go a little bit more in depth with these topics. Okay, so I just want to remind everybody about their personal behavior change project, the things that are due. So, first of all, you need to make a behavior intervention plan. Set a goal for how you're going to decrease or increase your behavior, whichever one applies. And then I want you to think about, are there particular situations where you see that target behavior increasing or decreasing? Anything you can do to remove or introduce these conditions? Okay, and so these are just some examples of things that you can do to alter your behavior. You do not have to do all of them. Okay, you'll then introduce the intervention. You'll need 5 data points, graph the data, blah, blah, blah. So you're going to do that reversal design and then discuss the results. So I've given you some suggested due dates. Each step is due by this day, but if you want to go ahead and get rocking and rolling and do it, that's fine. Okay. Another reminder about your major topics. I want to remind you that those are due the Sunday night of the week in which they are assigned. It's actually in green font in the calendar in the syllabus. If you ever want me to double check the article you've selected, remember there are guidelines, email it to me at least a week ahead of time so I have time to review it and give you feedback, and you can select another one if necessary. But so far, they've been really great, and I hope it's been helpful to you. I have been using the Canvas feedback feature, so if you aren't able to see the feedback, let me know. Okay, and the quiz 2 is going to open at 5 p.m. today. It's going to close on Friday at midnight. Same as before, it's a Word document, so you can either complete it in Word and then submit it on Canvas. You can handwrite it and submit me a picture, or you can put it in my box by Friday. All right, finally, SAFMEDS. The sign up for checkout is posted on Canvas. You must sign up. The last spot for set 2 is on Monday, so you need to do it by Monday. If you don't sign up, then you aren't going to be able to check out. Um, so then you're not going to get a grade. So if there isn't a spot that works for you, you need to email to arrange an alternate time by the end of today, Tuesday, end of class. So let me know if any of those times don't work. I'm more than happy to be flexible and find a time that does work. I just don't want to be emailing on Monday for alternate days. We need to go ahead and get that scheduled. So looking forward, again, you have quite a bit due this week. So you had your discussion guide that's due tonight, quiz due Friday, SAFMED's checkout. It's actually on Monday the 8th. And then you have your step 4 behavior change project due. Next week, we're moving into our final unit. It's kind of hard to believe. But we'll be talking about contingency contracting, token economy, group contingencies, and self management, all super fun things. To talk about, especially those of us with classroom experience, and we can think about the common behavior management techniques that we see in classrooms. And I think it'll be interesting as you read and complete your discussion guide to see what the science is behind some of those practices. Okay. So again, if you have any questions or any concerns, please email me and let me know, and I will be available today from 2 to 3 p.m. via Zoom or in my office if anybody needs me.